Lara stared at the piano in front of her, her fingers frozen over the keys as the silence of the apartment weighed around her. Ever since her mother's death 3 months ago, she hadn't been able to play. The notes that once flowed so naturally now seemed trapped inside her, blocked by a grief she didn't know how to express. The piano, a gift from her mother, a family heirloom full of stories, had become a painful reminder, a constant echo of what she had lost. That night, Lara decided to try once more. She sat down, resting her hands on the keyboard. But, as in the past few weeks, nothing came. No melody. Just emptiness. Exhausted, she gave up and went to bed. The weariness, combined with the sadness, quickly put her to sleep. And then, in the quiet of her slumber, the music came. It was a dream. In it, Lara was sitting at the piano, but this time her hands moved effortlessly, playing a melody she had never heard before. The notes flowed smoothly, forming a hypnotic song, full of sadness and beauty. It was so vivid that it felt real. The melody wrapped around every part of her mind, and Lara felt overtaken by a strange familiarity, as if the music had always been there, waiting to be discovered. When she woke up, the first rays of sunlight flooding her room, Lara could still hear the melody in her head. For a moment, she thought it had all been just an invention of her subconscious, an escape from reality. But something pushed her to get out of bed, walk over to the piano, and try to reproduce what she had heard. With trembling fingers, she began to play. To her surprise, the notes came easily, faithfully recreating the music from the dream. Each chord was perfect, as if she had practiced the piece countless times. The melody was melancholic, almost ethereal, and Lara felt something different as she played, an inexplicable connection to the music, as if something was guiding her. She played the song to the end, and when the last chord echoed through the apartment, Lara remained there, silent, perplexed. There was something deeply unsettling about how easily the music had come to her. And even more disturbing was the feeling that the melody wasn't hers. Unsure of what to think, she stepped away from the piano, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe she had heard something similar somewhere, and her brain had just reproduced the music during the dream. But as the morning went on, the feeling of strangeness didn't fade. On the contrary, a sense of unease began to grow in her chest, as if something dark was just beginning. In the days that followed, Lara couldn't get the melody out of her head. She tried to focus on other things, but the song always came back, persistent, like an insistent whisper. It was as if the music was alive, demanding to be played. One afternoon, unable to resist any longer, Lara sat down at the piano again. Her fingers glided over the keys, and the melody flowed with the same unsettling ease as before. This time, however, something changed. As she played, a chill ran down her spine, as if the air around her had grown denser, heavier. The apartment, once silent and comforting, suddenly felt hostile. She tried to shake off the feeling but couldn't ignore the goosebumps rising on her skin. That's when, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something. A shadow moving in the living room mirror. The reflection was distorted, as if the edges of the mirror were lightly rippling. Lara abruptly stopped playing and turned to face the mirror, but there was nothing. Just her own image, static and lifeless, staring back at her. She took a step back, her heart racing. Was she becoming paranoid? Maybe it was the stress, the still fresh grief, the longing for her mother. But as she looked around the apartment, something seemed different. The place, once her refuge, now felt distant, as if it no longer belonged to her. That night, sleep was restless. Disjointed dreams invaded her mind, always accompanied by the same melody. Lara woke up several times, drenched in sweat, with the music pounding in her ears. She tried to disconnect, but the chords felt like a constant presence, an unwelcome companion. The next morning, exhausted, she decided to record the song. Maybe if she listened to it more objectively, she could understand where her strange fascination was coming from. She placed the recorder on the piano, adjusted the microphone, and began to play. The notes filled the apartment, enveloping the space with that melancholic melody, which seemed laden with something more, something Lara couldn't define. When she finished, she pressed the button to listen to the recording. The sound of the piano filled the room, for only a few seconds. Soon, the recording turned to static, then absolute silence. There was nothing more. The music she had played simply wasn't there. Lara felt a wave of cold crawl up her spine. How was that possible? The recorder worked perfectly. She tested other songs, and they were all recorded correctly. But the dream melody, it was as if it couldn't be captured. As if the sound had been swallowed by the air. Confused and now definitively scared, Lara began to feel that something was very wrong with that music. Something she couldn't control, and that was beginning to control her. Lara hesitated to play the piano again, but the melody consumed her from within. She tried to distract herself with other activities, but the music kept resurfacing in her mind, clearer each time, as if it were begging to be released. The more she resisted, the more she felt an overwhelming presence around her, as if the apartment were full, though she was alone. One night, unable to bear the weight of this strange connection any longer, she approached the piano. Her hands, almost of their own will, rested on the keys. As she struck the first chord, the air around her seemed to shift, growing heavier, denser. As the melody took shape, shadows began to move across the room, far more distinct than before. They were no longer just vague reflections, now, they were figures. The forms around her started to materialize, taking on the vague appearance of people. They were pale, with empty eyes, silently watching her. Lara's heart raced, but she couldn't stop playing. Her fingers moved on their own, guided by the melody. With each note, the figures drew closer, becoming more defined, as though the music was calling them out of the darkness. Lara recognized some of the figures with horror. Among the indistinct faces, she saw Edgar Meyer himself, the missing composer, and others she had seen in her research, musicians who had died or vanished after playing that very piano. They surrounded her, trapped in some sort of limbo, all staring directly at her. Their eyes were expressionless, but their bodies leaned forward, as if they were waiting for something. Then, as she continued to play, Lara heard it. It was no longer incomprehensible whispers. It was a clear voice from one of the spirits closest to her, a tall, thin man whose features were worn by time. He slowly moved closer, and though his mouth didn't move, his words were unmistakable, "Finish the song." A chill ran down Lara's spine. Everything became clear in that moment. The music she had been playing, the same melody from her dreams, was the key to freeing those spirits, to completing something that had been left unfinished for decades. But she also knew, with the same clarity, that finishing it would mean surrendering herself to the same fate as them. Completing the song would seal her own end. And yet, she couldn't stop. Her hands, once her tools, were now prisoners of the melody. The piano seemed to have a life of its own, and Lara knew she was being used to complete the work those spirits had left unfinished. When the last note rang out, a brief pause filled the air. The spirits, now closer than ever, seemed to be waiting for the finale. But Lara, in a panic, realized she was about to make the most important decision of her life. Lara was breathing heavily, the air in the apartment too thick, almost unbreathable. The spectral figures surrounded her, their empty eyes fixed on her, as if waiting for the conclusion of something they had waited for far too long. The last note of the melody still echoed softly in the room, but the silence that followed was suffocating, full of expectation. "Finish the song." The spirit's words echoed in her mind like an inescapable command. Lara looked at the piano keys, her fingers trembling, hesitating over the keyboard. She knew she was close. Just a few more chords, and the music would be complete. Yet, a sense of dread grew in her chest. What if finishing the song meant being trapped there forever, like the others? Lara abruptly stood up from the piano, stepping away from the keys as if a simple touch could seal her fate. She felt the gaze of the shadows intensify, as if the figures were growing impatient. Their mouths now moved, whispering in unison, urging, pleading, demanding that she finish. "Please, free us." It was a plea, but what would happen to her if she did? Lara backed up against the wall, her heart racing, her mind torn between two fears, being trapped among those lost souls forever, or being consumed by something she didn't fully understand. The spirits, especially Mayer, were drawing closer, their lifeless faces reflecting the weight of an eternity of suffering. Lara instinctively clutched her chest, her heart pounding so hard she feared she might faint. Yet, alongside the terror, there was a sense of inevitability. She knew the music was inside her now, flowing through her veins, filling her thoughts. There was no escaping it. The melody felt alive, waiting to be completed, and she was the only one who could do it. "If I finish, will this all end?" Lara murmured, her voice low and fragile. The spirits seemed to nod, moving even closer to her, as if each one could already feel the freedom just beyond their spectral hands. The thought of freeing them tempted her, but it also terrified her. What about her? What fate awaited her after the last note? She looked at the piano one last time. The tension among the spirits was palpable, as if they could already taste the freedom they had been denied for so long. Lara felt herself standing at the edge of an abyss, and playing those final notes would mean stepping into the unknown. With her eyes closed, she made a decision. Return to the piano and play, or resist and try to break the cycle once and for all. Each choice had its consequences, one more terrible than the other.